Hello and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I'm your host, Shawn Needham, along with my wonderful wife, Janet, and we are streaming live from the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy Podcast Studio. And we are super excited to have Chad Lewis on our show today discussing his book, Doing Diabetes Differently. And we were just talking about a little bit before the show about how I did read the forward in his book, and it just is right up our alley. You guys that follow this podcast, you will and listen to Janet and I over and over. The way we treat diabetes in this country is completely wrong. And I don't care if you're a type 1, type 2 diabetic, and I get people out there saying, I don't know what I'm talking about because type 2s are so much different than type 1. And that is true in the sense that how they manifest, but there's still a carbohydrate metabolism problem. Per definition, diabetes mellitus means honey siphon in Greek. It means we are urinating out too much sugar. So one of the fixes for that is to eat less sugar, eat less carbohydrates. And of course, Chad goes into that in his book. Chad, welcome to our show.
Thank you. And Janet and Shawn, thank you for having me. I look forward to talking about a lot of different ways to do diabetes, not only differently, but more healthily.
Exactly. The book could be called The Right Way to Do Diabetes. So I really love the forward, and I'm getting ready to read the rest of the book. And I appreciate you being on. I appreciate what you're doing, because I really honestly believe in the traditional sense that we are treating diabetes today with the American Diabetic Association and most diabetic educators and most physicians. The answer is to just eat as much carbs as you want and turn up your insulin pump. And I think you have an example of that in your book. And it's like, that does not make any sense. So tell us how you got to writing this book and a little bit about your history and how you got to be on our podcast.
Okay, well, I've had type 1 diabetes for 54 years. The photo that you have of me posted online is me wearing my Joslin Clinic medal that they give to people who live 50 years who have type 1. Not very many people make it this long. And I have spent a lifetime with the disease, studying the disease, thinking about the disease. About 14 years ago, I had an epiphany around low carb eating. And it made a big difference. I lost 40 pounds. I got off the glycemic roller coaster. All other indices of health improved. And I thought I saw the light. And I did, partially. But as time went on, I thought, well, there's a lot more to this. And that began my research. During the course of the last 6 years, I lost many dear friends to diabetes. All of them had type 2. And I felt that all of my friends didn't necessarily have to die early from diabetes, or most certainly didn't have to die the way they did. So, COVID hit, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to write this book. And I'm going to encapsulate in the book all the points of view that I've developed that really differ from standard practice and conventional wisdom. In the process, I had to do a real hard look at standard practice and conventional wisdom, and that is how I begin the book.
So Janet,
that's how it happened.
Okay. I'm going to have Janet ask you some questions, because Janet's always good at answering appropriate questions.
Well, Chad, I hear you message or I hear your message about how your friends passed. And we watch them suffer. And so I think that's probably the motivating factor for behind this book, is that you were tired of seeing people around you suffer for something that can be solved. In your case, type 1 is something that, you're going to have to live with. But I also feel like type 2 is not something, I think it's resolvable. I think they can change that. But that being said, Can you just give us a story as how you became or how you started your journey with type 1? Because I think that's kind of important. Because right now it seems like it's type 2 and, everybody seems to have that diagnosis, but there is a difference between type 1 and 2, and Shawn alluded to it, but just kind of what was your journey when you first realized that you had something that you needed to address?
Well, I can't go over the 54 years. It was quite a
No.
journey. But, I'll go back to when I had my epiphany. It occurred when I read Dr. Richard Bernstein's book.
Yes, I love Dr. Bernstein. Yeah.
And I liked his attitude, and I liked much of what he said. I practiced ketogenic eating during the period that I lost 40 pounds and all my health markers improved. And I became a true believer. But the thing is, Shawn and Janet, is ketogenic eating is one approach. In doing my research on nutrition, for example, I found there is also a high carb, very low fat, plant-based approach that can also be effective, especially for people with type 2 diabetes. So you think about diabetes and nutrition, the way I liken it now is as a type of teeter-totter, where you have very low fat, high carb on one plank, and very low carb, high fat on the other, with protein sitting in the middle as the fulcrum in moderate amounts. And that was basically my model that I came to with nutrition. This is only one example. I read, I swear, every nutrition trade book ever written. I looked at the debates, and I began to liken it to the story of the old fable of the blind men and the elephant, where they're all grabbing a different part of the elephant, and they're describing the elephant based on the part they're grabbing.
Right.
You can find a lot of truth in what all sides of the debate have to say. Today, I eat a lower carbohydrate diet. I am not in a state of ketosis, and it means that I have to be especially careful about how much protein I eat, because the body craves glucose, and gluconeogenesis from protein will take over if I eat too much. But otherwise, I follow the practices of healthy diabetic eating that I describe in my chapters on nutrition. I picked out an example from nutrition just to show how I depart from standard practice and conventional wisdom, which basically today is all about trying to figure out how to cover all the crap you eat with medication. That's basically the model. And I found in my research that if you are insulin dependent, it's impossible to cover the standard American diet with insulin. Adam Brown, in his excellent book, talks about 42 different factors that affect blood glucose. Carb to insulin ratio is only one of them. So I would like to see, to wrap up this part, my response to your question, I would like to begin with changing the objective of diabetes management, both for people with type 1 and people with type 2. There isn't a healthcare provider in the world who will disagree with the goal of safely managing healthy blood sugar. I think we're all on the same page with that. But I would like to see the goal changed to safely managing healthy blood sugar using a minimum of medication.
Sure.
Yeah.
If
Right.
patients and doctors, if we went into it with that mindset, the nutrition and exercise and mental part factors would follow.
That's right. The interesting thing is that some of the ways we treat diabetes not only doesn't make sense, but actually could make things worse. I mean, a good example, you talk about insulin. I mean, given a type 2 diabetic insulin, they already have enough insulin. It's just not working well enough. Giving a type 2 diabetic more insulin is like literally throwing gasoline on a house fire. It's that's not what they need. I mean, they need to change their diet, and it seems like that just is not following in the typical narrative in medicine. So it's nice that you write this book, because the only way we're going to get this information out there is to educate and empower individuals to take charge of their own health and do their own research.
Well, polypharmacy, as you well know, is a blight on all of us who have diabetes. Jason Fung, who has written some excellent books, one I especially like is called The Diabetes Code.
Mm-hmm.
And he also has one called The Obesity Code, but they're almost the same book.
And The Cancer Code, they're all the same.
Right. The same thing. But he talks about the futility of giving an individual who is severely obese. We don't say morbidly obese anymore, Shawn. I learned this recently. We say severely obese, class 3 obesity. We're softening the language everywhere.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to hurt anybody's feelings,
But at any rate, he talks about the futility of giving that person 100 units of insulin to manage their blood sugar when insulin is the fat storage hormone.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. So we need people to eat differently and exercise differently, who have diabetes, and really across the board. But the thing is, if I just wrote a book where I said you need to eat and exercise differently, I wouldn't be that much different than everyone else, in terms of talking about doing diabetes differently. So what I did is I started off by describing the current hierarchy of diabetes care in this country. And then I talked about the way I think it should change. And if you can picture a pyramid in the contemporary hierarchy of diabetes care, you have drugs and devices as forming the very foundation, as being the most important.
Yeah.
Then nutrition, then exercise, and way up here on the tip is what I call the mental part. And you look at the assembly line, typical situation where someone with diabetes goes to the healthcare provider. 15 minutes later, they've got a tweak in their medication and off they go. Well, I'd like to see that pyramid inverted. I think the most important part, if we're going to get to eating and exercising more healthily, is the mental part. That's where we should start. And I spend a lot of the front part of my book talking about changing the mental part. And a couple of key features. Number one, we need to change the definition of diabetes management, which I've already described. The goal should be to minimize medication while safely managing healthy blood sugar. But the other thing that we need to do, I believe, is we need to go back old school. The American Diabetes Association, around the turn of this century, got rid of their list of forbidden foods. They moved, in their words, from a position of deprivation to a position of moderation. And that set the course for people with diabetes going, well, yeah, I can have an ice cream cone. The American Diabetes Association says as long as they account for the sugar, the glucose, the carbohydrates, and the ice cream cone, I just have to figure out how to do that. Pizza's the same way. Cheeseburgers. We've moved away from that list of forbidden foods. I say bring that list back.
Yeah.
People with diabetes also, I believe, need to appreciate that they have a serious chronic condition, like emphysema. If you went to your doctor, would your doctor say it'd be okay to smoke cigarettes as long as you just did it on the weekends?
Right.
No. And
Right.
our condition is very similar to that.
Yeah.
And then, softening the language. In 2016, the American Diabetes Association decreed that we would no longer refer to people as being diabetic.
Yeah. Right.
Or they wouldn't. Don't use diabetic as a noun or diabetes as a noun. We are people who have diabetes. We are not defined by diabetes. Well, when I talk about diabetes, I practice that, out of respect for my fellow persons with diabetes. But when I look at myself in the mirror every morning, I say, "Hi, Chad, you're a diabetic. That's what you are. And you need today to take that into account as you move through your day, as you eat healthily, as you exercise healthily, because this is your situation." Which brings me to the final part of the mental part. I brought in 12-step thinking. I borrowed it from Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've applied it to diabetes management. The two conditions have a lot in common. Both are chronic diseases. Both, if not well managed, will result in chaos and health problems and probably an early death.
Yep.
Both affect everyone around them. And when I practice this variant on 12-step thinking, I try to live in the present. I realize that I cannot eat like everyone else, and I live one day at a time, as best as I can.
Well, and one of the things, and I think, considering I've talked to at least a handful of them, of dietitians that I don't know if they're trained by the American Diabetic Association or they just know the narrative there. But, talking about, they used to say what kind of foods are prohibited, and they don't do that anymore. It's like moderation. And
Yeah.
I remember one time I was in a social media chat, and I was told that we shouldn't deny diabetics anything. If we shouldn't deny them birthday cake, was the exact example she used. And I said, well, the problem I have is that if we don't deny diabetics certain foods, we will end up denying them their feet, their eyesight, and their kidneys. So they can choose either way. She didn't like my response, but I use that because like you say, it's a serious chronic disease. And if you don't manage it now, you will end up having your kidneys fail, your eyes fail, and you'll have your feet cut off. Those are just facts.
Well, that is the fact. And across our society, it's getting so much worse. Today, a third of all American adults, are either pre-diabetic or diabetic.
A third.
By 2040, at the current rate, a third of Americans could have diabetes. It is epidemic.
Yep.
And it's an epidemic that is far worse than COVID, far worse than AIDS.
Yep.
It's taking over our economy even. So another fact, I mean, this one blows my mind. Recent study. Since 2010, only 21% of type 1 adults in the study were hitting a 7.0 A1C. 79% were above that, above 7.0, which is an average blood sugar of 154 milligrams per deciliter. And among kids, it was even worse. Only 17% were hitting 7.0. It's gotten worse since 2010. And the other part of that is 7.0 A1C is a terrible cutoff.
Yeah.
The American Association of Clinical Endocrinology has a cutoff of 6.5, which makes a lot more sense. That's an average blood sugar of 140 milligrams per deciliter. But it's getting worse. It's not getting better. And standard practice and conventional wisdom isn't cutting it.
Janet, you had a question?
Well,
or comment?
Yeah. So, I mean, we are looking at an epidemic of obesity in our country. And so, along with that comes all the other diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, stroke. And now we're talking about young children. So, the movement that I'm seeing play out in front of me is, instead of handling it with our diet, now let's start taking shots to stop, your hunger. So, what's your feeling about some of these new products out there like Ozempic and Mounjaro and peptides to help people lose weight?
Well, first of all, there was nothing I could do about it. I missed the GLP-1 revolution. My book came out in the fall of 2022. I thought a well-ordered discussion about the futility of dieting in my book. We should never, ever, ever go on a diet. We eat a diet, but we should never go on one.
Right.
Doing this 12-step thinking approach. But at any rate, I missed that. And I wish I could have responded to it. Because in my view, semaglutide is just another variation on dieting. Instead of restricting food, you're going to take a pill or you're going to do an injection. But the concept is the same. And gastroparesis is a diabetes complication. It involves delayed gastric emptying. It involves stomach upset. It involves all kinds of things that describe some of the side effects of a GLP-1.
Right.
So you're basically making yourself sick, your body sick, with these medications, and you're going to lose weight. But you'll have to take that medication for the rest of your life, because recent stuff, they're just starting to, dig this up. The weight's just going to come right back.
Yeah, if you don't change your habits, it's going to come right back. That's what we talk about. It's like, I like to say, it's like, does your body have a semaglutide deficiency? No, it does not. So you really need to change your habits. That's why you have type 2 diabetes, is because of your eating habits. And there's no drug, there's no surgery that's going to change that long term. You have to change the way you eat.
Well, I have this underlying fear that, sorry to interrupt you, I have this underlying fear that when we move it to our pediatric and younger population, that we're going to severely affect their body's ability to build muscle and bone. So now we're going to be really depleted because we're not taking nutrients in that we need to become an adult. Because the obesity in young children is off the chart.
Have you heard the term double diabetes?
I have not.
Not sure.
Okay, so
Go.
These are people with type 1 diabetes who have metabolic syndrome and are obese.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Whereas that's what I was, okay? Well, now with kids, what we used to call adult onset diabetes, we can't call it that anymore, because we are developing a generation of children who have type 2 diabetes. It's unprecedented.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And when you imagine the effects on a cardiovascular system, which is the number one killer of people with diabetes, especially type 2s, when that process starts when a kid's 8 years old,
Right.
and yet this is happening. We can see the phenomenon on our TV sets when we watch a commercial for pizza, followed by a commercial for Tresiba, a basal
That's right.
insulin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, they just take turns.
Yeah.
And yet, if you have diabetes and you go to a seminar, in my experience, they'll trot out pizza and say, here's how you can eat pizza with this disease. I went to a nutrition workshop a few years ago at a diabetes conference in San Diego, where the nutritionist in front of a group of 100 people with type 1 diabetes used the example of dosing for a double Whopper versus a single Whopper.
Unbelievable.
This is baked into standard practice and conventional wisdom.
Right. Right. So do you think, Chad, do you really think the system, the healthcare system and the American Diabetes Association, do you really think they want to reverse?
I've lost you. I can't hear you, Shawn.
Did it? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you really think in our system, in our healthcare system and the American Diabetes Association, do you really think that they want to reverse type 2 diabetes or, make people less dependent on medications? Do you really think they do?
Well, if I believed that this was being done purposefully, I would have to be a conspiracy theorist. And I'm not. I can look back over the history as I did when I wrote the book, and I can see how all of this evolved, and it was so broad and so sweeping, Shawn, that I don't think any single entity, whether it was the ADA or big pharma, could have made this happen. I think it's just a sad accident of different events and different technologies. Related to that, let's just say I'm a person with diabetes and I know how to eat correctly. Let's just say I do. The doctor will say, okay, you know how to do it, Chad, go out and do it. But we have not given people the tools, the mental tools for how to do that. It doesn't make sense to say on the one hand, you can eat anything you want, even if you have diabetes, because we have all these magic drugs and devices. And then on the other hand, say, well, you better eat healthily. We're sending mixed messages. And I think this has been the real problem. I don't think it's purposeful.
Yeah.
Well,
and I don't know if it was purposeful, but here's what my opinion is, at least where we're at now. It might not have been purposeful 20, 30, 40 years ago, but I just think it is so blatant how bad we're doing now in the medical system with treating people with diabetes that it looks like to me it's apparent that we don't want to really help people reverse their diabetes. And there's doctors that tell type 2 diabetics that you can't reverse type 2 diabetes. And I get it, your Alcoholics Anonymous comparison with the 12-step program and diabetic versus alcoholic, that you always have it. I get that, but we can definitely reverse the out of control glucoses with diet alone. We don't need fancy drugs or fancy glucose monitors to do that.
We need to show people how to do that.
Yep.
Which is, of course, why I wrote the book. The thing is, it's language. I don't think a care provider should ever tell a person with diabetes, especially type 2, but they do. You see it in the literature. They should never, ever say it's a progressive disease.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be a progressive
No,
disease.
it does not. Absolutely not.
And they
In
need
fact,
to
it
get
can be a regressive disease.
At any rate, in all the different areas, Shawn, that I went through, I ended up finding that my views were different than sort of the mainstream, which is why I came up with the title of the book with the help of a good friend on the East Coast. Take exercise. There are so many misconceptions about exercise. For example, with exercise, the notion that you have to sweat hours in a gym when in fact you can get by with 75 minutes a week of vigorous exercise, up to 2.5 hours of moderate exercise, and you can apportion it during the week.
Yep. Yep.
The other mistake, and you see this everywhere in the literature, is this notion that exercise has to be fun. Over and over again, we see this. I actually have a quote from Sherry Kohlberg, Dr. Sherry Kohlberg, who's written some wonderful books on diabetes and exercise, where she expressly states, you have to find something fun to do. Well, baloney. Differentiate between exercising for health and exercising for fun. If you create the expectation that you're doing it for health and you don't have to have fun, and you only have to do it for 25 minutes, 6 days a week, then it's not different than mowing the lawn, brushing your teeth, or doing any of the other activities of, rote daily living. If you position it that way,
right,
you can make exercise happen.
That's right. That's a really good analogy. I like the lawn and brush your teeth analogy. Most people will make sure their lawn's mowed. Most people will brush their teeth every day. Well, then you should exercise every day if you want to stay healthy.
Well, and understand also that despite what the $30 billion gym industry would have you think, you don't have to join one of those places.
No.
As you said in one of your presentations, you were talking about using a kettle weight and how you could have it at home. I use two 15-pound dumbbells.
Yep. You don't need a lot of fancy equipment. No. So as we wrap this podcast up, Chad, tell us what you have a passion for.
Well, I developed a passion for playing golf.
Oh, good.
And, that's a wonderful exercise, but I don't do it for fun. I mean, I do it for fun. I don't do it for health.
Yeah.
I even ride a cart.
Good for you.
I do my exercising for health, in a different way. And I like, I've started up a deal to teach people how to play the banjo, which I play, and I worked in education all my life, so I've enjoyed that as a hobby as well.
So we're going to go ahead and stream your book here, and tell us if anybody has any questions. What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, you can go to my email, which is doingdiabetesdifferently@gmail.com, or you can go to my webpage, which you're showing right now, which is doingdiabetesdifferently.com.
And so as we wrap up, Chad, if you had to say one or two sentences of the best thing to motivate a person with diabetes, what would you say? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, well, I'm I would say read my book.
No, there you go.
but independent of that, it starts with the mental part. Don't leap ahead to nutrition and exercise and playing with drugs and devices. It starts up here.
Yep.
And developing a mental frame that allows you to say no and to disagree with this notion that you can eat pizza. And to spend some time reading, read trade books on nutrition, read Richard Bernstein on diabetes. There's Cyrus Kambata and Robbie Barbero wrote a book called Mastering Diabetes, which is just the opposite of Richard Bernstein. It's a very high carb, plant-based, very low fat book, but read that one too. And
just so you know, both sides of the spectrum.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it starts with the mental part.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And that's, honestly, Chad, that's the first time I've heard that. And that is really, really important. If you can't get in a mindset of why these things are important, then, everything else is just a waste of time.
Well, you end up, I hate to use this trite definition of insanity, but you end up doing the same thing over and over and over, expecting different results.
Yep. That's
and
right.
A variation on that, like I was 14, 15 years ago, I was just banging my head against a brick wall. I just couldn't. My doctor was delighted because my A1C was around 6.5. But boy, I sure wasn't.
Yeah. Well, hey, I recommend your book. If anybody out there has diabetes or pre-diabetes or is worried about it, read this book. Super easy reading. I read the foreword already, and I'm going to read the rest of the book later. But it really, not only do I think it's a way to treat diabetes differently, I think it's the right way to treat diabetes. So thank you for being on our show today, Chad, and talking about your book. Thank you for writing the book. And you've helped us realize our goal, which is to educate and empower individuals to take charge of their own health. So thank you so much, Chad, for being on our show.
Thank you, Shawn, for having me.
You're welcome. And listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in today to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Do not miss out Thursday, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., our midweek podcast. Janet and I will be by ourselves talking about our 500th episode. This is episode 499, and we're going to be talking about our 500th episode and the history and the future of our podcast. So thank you, listeners and viewers, for tuning in to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham. Thank you.